Okay, ladies and gentlemen and children from the local national school, you're all very welcome here on today, the 18th of December. It's the anniversary of the Battle of Gortroe, which took place here in the farmyard of Widow Johannah Ryan, just behind us in 1834. And people say, I suppose, this monument was erected in 1984, which was 150 years after the event. And for a few years after that, I suppose we didn't gather here that often, but with the last few years now, we've started just gathering just on this morning at this time, just coming up to 12 o'clock, because it was at 12 o'clock the first shots were fired. So it's just nice to commemorate, and I suppose this year and next year, there's a lot of commemorations going on of things that happened in the War of Independence and the Civil War in the 1920s, but this was obviously long before that. And normally when we gather here, where you're thinking of people that were shot dead, shot in cold blood, there's a certain amount of sadness, and of course there should be sadness, but we also should gather as locals, not just from Bartlemy but from all the surrounding parishes. We should gather here and we do gather here, not just in sadness but in extreme pride, because these were people. We were remembering below on Castlines last week an ambush took place in 1920 when the IRA took on the might of the British Army, guns against guns. These people here in 1834 had no guns, maybe sticks and stones, maybe a few of them had hurleys, and they knew the people that they were resisting had guns. They still decided to take them on. So I just thought this morning, rather than gather in complete sadness, we've got to start just with a verse of a song which some of you will know, and children might know, but most of the adults will know. This happened in 1834, and that year a young man that was born in Mallow was celebrating his 20th birthday. He was a man called Thomas Davis. He was born in 1814. His father was a Welshman, a British soldier, a Protestant, and he died within 12 months of Thomas Davis being born in Mallow. So Thomas Davis's mother took him in after a few years to Dublin. And Thomas Davis, even though with a strange background like that, a very unusual background, grew up to be a great nationalist. And you know, he died, he was only 30 years when he died. Only 30 years when he died. But he wrote some beautiful songs. And I often think he was probably inspired. He was 20 years old when this terrible tragedy happened here. And why was he inspired? This tragedy was covered, I had to imagine 1834, it was covered in 146 different newspapers in each of the English-speaking continents in the world. In 1834, it was covered in 136 different newspapers. And I would have thought that a song that Thomas Davis wrote at the time, he would have been inspired by things that happened in places like this, and it goes like this. When boyhood's fire was in my blood, I read of ancient freemen for Greece and Rome who bravely stood, 300 men and 3 men. And then I prayed I yet might see a nation once again, a nation once again, a nation once again. When Ireland long a province be, a nation once again. The background to what happened here on the 18th of December is, we're all Irish people. If we were told in the moment we have to pay tax to the Irish government, we have to accept that. We don't like it, we have to accept it. But if we were told, as well as paying tax to the Irish government, you must also pay tax to the English government or the French government, you'd say, no, that's wrong, that's completely wrong. And that's basically what happened here. When Ireland and England were joined together in 1800 under the Act of Union, one government for Ireland and England, and it became the United Kingdom. And what happened as well as that then, even though 97% of the people in this country were Catholics, Roman Catholics, the Protestant faith, the Church of Ireland, became the established church. Even though under the Act of Union, that's the way it was, that was the church of the state, even though 97% of the people were Catholic. And there was a tax then you had to pay to the church to keep your clergymen going. Today we call it dues, you pay so much to the clergymen, to the Catholics. But there was a tax at the time called tithes, which was 1/10. So if you were a farmer, you had to pay 1/10 of your produce to the church. But in this case in Ireland, you had to pay that to the Protestant church. You didn't go to the Protestant church, you had no truck with the Protestant clergy, you might have got on well with them, but you had nothing to do with them, but you had to pay, it was like this, if you had 10 drills of spuds, one had to go to the church. If you had 10 cattle, one had to go to the church. If you had 10 reeks of hay, one had to go to the church. And that obviously was a very, very unjust tax. You had to support your own clergy naturally, but then you had to support other clergy that you weren't using. And by the 1820s, instead of giving drills of spuds or turnips or cattle to the Protestant clergy, it was a money amount, it was a tax. And it was a tax put on every single landholder. If you're only an acre land, there was a tax put on it, and you had to pay what was called the tithes. In the 1820s, there was wars on all over Europe. The price of grain was great, the price of horses was great, the price of butter, the price of cattle was flying, and farming in Ireland was going well. But when those wars finished, the Napoleonic wars finished, there was a crash, worse than the crash we've had in recent years, an economic downturn, and farmers were only barely eking out a living. Did the tax to the church go down? No. They still had to pay the same tithes every year. So a lot of resistance built up, and one of the people that was living here at the time was the Widow Johannah Ryan. She was Barry from Ballydare. She was a Mrs. Ryan. Her husband had died in the 1820s. And she owed the clergyman, the Protestant clergyman here, he was Cook Collis, she owed him some people said it was £3, other people said it was a pound and 18 shillings, and she didn't pay it. She just took a stand that she wouldn't pay it. And in the summer of 1834, that clergyman was replaced. There was a new clergyman came here, a man called Reverend William Ryder. He lived below in Ballinakilla house. It's a bed and breakfast house now. And he decided then that he was going to take a stand, and he was going to round the whole parish of Bartlemy and Commemoration, and whatever was owing to him, he was going to collect it, and by hell he was going to collect it. So on the Monday before this, on the 13th of December, he came to the farm where I was living. It was Buckley's were there in Garry and Haggard. He went up to McGrath's in Ballinakilla, where Michael Welch is living now, and several other farms that owed money, and if they didn't pay the money, he seized cattle and sheep and took them into the pound in Fermoy. He wasn't just a clergyman on his own. He brought out some of the military from Fermoy, some of the dragoons. When he was here on the 15th, he had 12 mounted soldiers with him and 10 or 12 policemen with him to enforce the law and to take what he said he was entitled to. So on the morning of the 18th of December here then, it was known that he was coming again, because what they do, they sent out what they call a process. It was like a summons to say, you owe this money and I'm going to collect it, and if you won't pay, I can seize. Under the British law of the country, they were entitled to seize stacks of hay, cattle or something in lieu. So the Widow Ryan and the people around here knew that they were coming. So on the evening before, you see a little replication here at the side of the plaque of a boy blowing a hunting horn. He was a Fitzgerald boy, and the signal was given. There's a pre-arranged signal on the evening before. So that he blew that hunting horn probably different times around, and other people took up the sound. So in other words, that was a signal there's something happening here tomorrow. So on the morning, the 18th December, early in the morning, there was a big crowd gathered above at the Cross of Bartlemy, and then the Boreen into the Widow Ryan's farm, mainly above at the Cross of Bartlemy. So Reverend William Ryder, with his force of, I think it was 24 mounted soldiers and 60 foot soldiers. Most of them came from Fermoy to Rockormac, up Holly Hill to Bartlemy. More of them came over here to Bluebell and up here. Above in the village in Bartlemy, where Woods is shopping, Dennis Barry's pub is, the Riot Act was read. That's where they read out saying, ye are gathered and ye should not be gathered. I call on ye to desist and go home. The Riot Act was read. It was read in English. Most of the people that time in the Bartlemy area were Irish speaking. A lot of them didn't even understand it. So the military turned above it and started coming down, and as they came down towards Ryan's farm, the local people came down inside the fields, inside the ditches, and gathered in the Boreen. There was two farms inside there. First you had McAuliffe's, and then you had Ryan's, just in beyond where Pat Ryan and Daniel Ryan's farm houses are now. And they gathered there, the locals, and they pulled farm cats across the Boreen to stop the military and the soldiers going in. Pulled them across. And there was, all the locals had, as I said initially, was sticks and stones. Some of them, they said they had hurleys. How many people were there? It varies. Some people said there was 150, so others said there was maybe 200 people there. So at about 11:30, Reverend William Ryder again and his son-in-law and Captain Alves, who was in charge of the military, again read the Riot Act. And people said, no, we are resisting. We're not leaving you pass in here. We're just not leaving you pass. They stopped. They were throwing stones at the military. The military now were all armed with muskets, with bayonets. So at about 11:55, Reverend William Ryder with Captain Alves gave the order, prepare to fire. So they had to load the muskets. They loaded the muskets that time. It wasn't like a machine gun that you'd see on the television now, where there was heaps of bullets. Each gun had to be loaded with one single bullet, loaded, prepared, and he gave the order, prepare to fire. And then, just 3 minutes ago, as they said, some of the people said at the inquest, the Angelus bell rang out in the church in Bartlemy because it was 12 noon just as the Angelus bell rang out, the shooting started. Initially, to send the inquest afterwards, many of the people thought they were only dummy bullets or fake bullets. They didn't think they'd actually fire live ammunition. And a lot of people thought they were just dummy bullets. But then there was round after round after round fired. In total, they reckon afterwards that there was, I'll just wait till the lorry pass now. In total there was 86 shots fired. And of course after the first volley, some of the people who were on the carts fell down, dead and bleeding, and more stood up to take their place because they didn't realise, my God, these people are after being shot, they're after being shot dead, they're after being killed, they didn't realise it. They just thought, and more people stood up on the carts, and more of them were shot. And then eventually people realised that they are shooting, these are live bullets, so the people started moving away. Then there was dead bodies on the Boreen, there was dead bodies inside the Widow Ryan's haggard, there was other people injured. The military pulled away the cats then and went down and demanded their tithe. He demanded his tax, and the Widow Ryan came out. Naturally, she was crying. She knew her son Richard was amongst the dead. There was a widow Collins, two of her sons. The only son she had, were also dead. Some were dead in the yard, some in the Boreen, some in the orchard field, some in the haggard. There was 9 people dead there on the spot. 9 dead. There was about, opinions vary, some said there was 15 or 16 injured, some others said it was 20 or 30. 3 of those died in the subsequent days. So just the names of those that died were, and we'll just have a minute's silence for them when we read out their names. Michael Barry, Michael Collins, Michael Lane, William Ambrose, William Cashman, Patrick Hutton, Richard Ryan, John Cotter, John Collins, brother of Michael, John Daly, William Toomey, and William Ivis. So I just ask you just to bow your heads for 1 minute in silence in memory. And somebody left this spot. It must have left at 12:10, and he must have been on horseback and must have gone down to Dr. Barry's bridge and got on a stagecoach or something, because in the Cork Mercantile Chronicle newspaper of that evening, which hit the streets at 4 o'clock in Cork, less than 4 hours after the killings here, there was a small square column in the front of that evening's paper, killings at Rector. So it was amazing journalism at the time. So within 3 or 4 days, this had become an international sensation. Daniel O'Connell spoke about it in the House of Commons. You might have seen an article at the Hollywood there where Charles Dickens, he was a parliamentary reporter at the time in the English Parliament. He wrote about it. It was taken up in papers. Over Christmas and after Christmas, before the burials, all the bodies were taken down, coffined, and shown below in the churchyard in Rector. And there was an inquest, and afterwards, into the early days of January, there was an inquiry held in Rector. And eventually, at the end of January, Reverend William Ryder and 6 others that were responsible were found guilty of homicide, whatever. They were found guilty of murder. They appealed it, of course, and they appealed it again, and they appealed it again, and they appealed it again. Nobody ever served a day's jail for the killings of these 12 men. But I suppose the sacrifice of those 12, you'd say, did they die in vain? But they didn't die in vain. First of all, what they stood up against, the tithes, within 3 years, because of all the campaigning after what happened here in Gortroe, within 3 years, the tithes were reduced by a quarter, and within 3 more years, the tithes were abolished. They were rolled up into the rates and the tax, so they were abolished. But the big thing, I always think personally, and I'm not blowing around trumpet here, the big thing that the sacrifice of those 12 men and the others taught us is, as Irish people, and it continued afterwards. There was a rising in 1846, which was aborted. There was a rising in 1867, which led to nothing. Eventually we had a rising in 1967 with a war of independence. But it was events like this taught the Irish people, nobody is going to save us if we won't stand up for ourselves and fight for what we believe in. That's what these people did here. Innocent people. There was no guns, no cannons, they had nothing. It wasn't like Bloody Sunday in Croke Park. The British were saying afterwards, oh, some of the people in Croke Park had guns. There was no guns here. They had absolutely nothing. They were fighting literally with their bare hands. And that's why that sense of independence is still, I think it's still in this area. And you know, you see the big part that people from around this whole area of North East Cork played in the War of Independence and played in, you know, forming Irish society and forming a new country. So these people, you know, when we gather here on a December day, as I said, we gather in sadness because they lost their lives. And the descendants, Eamon Heskin and Danny Ryan, are absolutely direct descendants, great-great-grandchildren of Johannah Ryan. And there's descendants of several others living in the parishes around here. But like the lesson that they have taught us is, if you believe in something, and you really believe in something, my God, it is worth giving your life for. Would we do it? I don't know. I don't know whether we would do it or not. But they were brave people, and they set a tradition in train, and we should never forget them. And especially I said it to the young people, we're only 14 years away, lads. Some of us mightn't be here, but in 14 years' time, we'll be celebrating the 200th anniversary of this, and hopefully we'll have a big gathering. You'll be all in your 20s and 30s at that time. We'll be all in our 80s and 90s, probably going down like that. Maybe we'll be here. But I always think, you know, it is just very important that we do remember occasions and events like this. They're part of our history and they're part of what made us. And now, before we conclude with the National Anthem, I'll ask Eamon and Danny just to lay this wreath here at the, and maybe Kay, would you join with them? Yeah, and Kay. Yeah. So you will do it, Danny. Yeah. All those that died here, we'll just say, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Souls of 12 people who died here and the subsequent days, may their souls rest in peace, and may the souls of all the faithful departed rest in peace, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. We'll just finish with the singing of National Anthem. Sheena fina fall at half a yowleg erin, wind or slew, Harting the Ronnie going, Favoid Vesser, Shanty Rushing Sharp.